As I was the last speaker of the ECHO seminars for the series of 2010-2011, I created a presentation with particularly the aim to challenge people's view on some of the concepts we know quite well. And we hadn't had the opportunity to record it there, so I will now actually just redo the presentation, try to stay as truthful as possible to my original presentation, but give you a little bit feedback related to the discussions we had later, because some of the parts of the presentation could of course be improved. So the title was Technological Singularity as the Emerging Embodiment of the Global Brain. So the first thing I will do during the presentation is start explaining this title. There's of course a subtitle, and that goes how losing degrees of freedom allows us to gain degrees of freedom. The whole idea is to show you this shift by looking at concrete activities around us. So first of all, the technological singularity. Now, if we go back, we know that it was a debate in the 40s or 50s about the problem that computers didn't have the computation power to be intelligence like humans would be. So they start investigating this related to the Moore's law, the acceleration of computing power. But then other people noticed that you could actually put this on the same acceleration related to life itself. And so we get to this graph in the end, where this is a logarithmic scale, right? And if you put that evolution on a logarithmic scale, they claim that it's more or less one line. And that allows us to find a moment in time where we actually expect what is called a singularity. So the singularity itself is a moment where the acceleration has increased to such a speed that we actually cannot know or say anything sensible about that point anymore. And so far that point has been pointed to 2045. So I'll come back to that later, but now let's introduce the global brain. The global brain is a metaphor that emerged as the internet starts emerging. And people, of course, noticed that the interconnectivity between all the computers is quite similar as the interconnectivity in our brain, with that difference that here the people are like the neurons in the brain. Basically, that's the metaphor. People are like neurons in a brain. What we'll try to do in this presentation is show that maybe we need to rethink the scale based on what is emerging today, because basically this is created in the starting 80s, 90s, and of course the whole internet hasn't stopped evolving. So let's take a closer look to what has evolved and figure out if this is actually more than a metaphor and what is really happening. So are we getting to a global brain? Now, we can also look at brain-related research, like go to cognition, and we see that one of the first trends I want to point out is that the shift from what they call a brain in a vat to the embodied brain. So at a certain moment, cognitive scientists notice like, okay, this is not possible. You cannot have a brain in a vat, right? This idea that you can interconnect all the neurons to a computer and then this brain in this vat can think that it's walking outside, that's a little bit outdated. What we actually know is that we have embodied brains, and you see that the complexity of that embodiment is really huge. It's a network to all kind of things. It always gets into more in smaller parts, and there are all these kind of sensory input. It's very complicated. Okay, so we of course want to figure out what does that mean. What does it mean for the global brain? What is a global brain embodiment? Is it Gaia? Well, we have this Gaia hypothesis that the whole world is one system, and in some of the first simulations, experiments they did, is show that if the sun keeps becoming hotter, then the biodiversity on the earth can actually absorb that. So those are like some of the experiments, and then you have this whole idea of Gaia hypothesis. But what does that really mean? I mean, is it just another metaphor? I mean, where are we going to? Okay, so let's try to look at what is emerging today related to new media technology, and all kind of other kind of mediations. So the first thing I want to show you is what is called, if I'm not mistaken, flash mobbing. So it's a grand central station. There are a number of agents, so they actually call the people the agents, and the mission is, I'll just run it, freeze in place at the exact same moment, right? So what you see is this is part of an art. This is actually a part of an artistic performance. So you see that some people participate in the art, and other peoples like this are the audience, right? So we have the audience. So we have on the one hand people participating in the art. Those were the people that freezed in place. The other part were audiences. And you see the dynamics here that, if you want to figure out, like, do people really want to get sucked up in a meta system transition and become part of this global embodiment? Well, I think this is an example created from art that actually shows us that people may actually really want this. And art always has been the front end innovators. So I think we should take a closer look at that. There are other things emerging, like can individuals make a difference? And therefore I like to show one of the a program that run recently about the food revolution, which is basically revolving around Jamie Oliver getting to a town and trying to change that town's eating habits. And on the background, you see like 1,000 people that have cooked with Jamie, and that's his way to actually make a difference. But what you see is that he becomes the lead in mediating, but he will not be the only one mediating. So we've seen flash mobs before with the central station as an art performance. In this case, you will see that the flash mobs, they are really fun, but they also are very useful, in this case as a kind of changing mentality. So let's see flash mob again. So you see again, we have audience and we have the agents of the system. And the agents behave all similar. So they lose degrees of freedom. But I hope you understand that in this, they are actually gaining degrees of freedom. They are having incredible fun. They're making a difference. They attract audience to start joining in. And there's a whole other level of mediation happening here. This is not individual anymore. So, so that's exactly what they see, right? It felt brilliant to do it, right? So what you see is that this flash mob, they are not just an art performance or just, it is an art performance and it is fun. But you see how you are losing degrees of freedom by gaining degrees of freedom. You are becoming more than what you are, because you become part of a whole. And depending on how you organize that, you could actually, we have seen in history moments that this has been organized to create fear over people, but in this case it's created to empower people, and that's very interesting. So let's see how other ways of empowerment has happened. This is a case that happened in India. So what happened is, on the top here, you see there was a riot in a bar, where men pulled out women because they were sitting in the bar, and they said that women shouldn't be sitting in the bar, they should be sitting at home and work for the family and not having fun in bars like this. So okay, this is an incredible act of violence in India. And what you get is this lady here down here that starts using the internet to create to actually fight oppression by humor, right? So what she did is like, forgot to tell this guy here. It's Iman that reacted on that event and said like, more of those events will happen, and we will actually beat more women if they are in bars. So he kind of used this event of radicalism to increase fear among people. And she was really wondering like, how do I react on this? So what she did is she creates this idea of sending during Valentine's Day an upgrade for this iman, or how do you call them, an upgrade for his underwear, because you could just see through his clothes and see that he has very dull white underwear. So she wanted to do this, and basically a lot of people reacted to it. And thanks to the mediation of the internet, they actually overflowed this radical group with pink underwear, and they were like extremely angry and annoyed, but they couldn't really react to it. And basically their whole force to spread fear got countered by this simple movement. And what I understood is that this is actually taken up by a governance to figure out how to actually react to radical groups. So this is another way of mediation. In this case, it's more individual, and there are artifacts created to create the mediation. So it's not like in the previous video with the flash mobs where you have it mediated by peers. But that's basically what we are seeing around us today. We see the ability to manage a crowd. In this case, we are looking to the participants of an open source conference called DrupalCon. And I think it's 1,500 people. Now they are with 3,000 people. And the question is, how do you mediate such a crowd? And basically 3,000 people aren't even that much if you look at what's happening in the Arabic world. This is, if I'm not mistaken, that Tajir square in Egypt. I see tanks over there, and over here you see that people are starting to redefine what mediation means in large groups. So there is this notion called technology mediated social participation, which kind of well maps with what happens there. Now that notion is kind of a call to interdisciplinary research, but well, it can be a useful term to work with. We of course know it better from the point of self-organization and stigmergy. Basically what happens on the left here is that if there is a random distribution of all kind of directions, you see that by the interactions between the elements, you get some kind of a local organization. So some are in one direction and the others in the other. And then finally you get to the full self-organization, although it's not one organization. So you see that there are these interfaces here, these borders between the different kind of organizations. Stigmergy is a very interesting concept dating back from the 50s, from investigating termites and ants and other social creatures. And what you basically see if you analyze their behavior is that they see a stigma, so a sign, and they will act on that sign and therefore create a second state, so second to third. So in this case, the termite just tries to drop its piece of dirt on top of other dirt. That's the basic simple rule, but in the end it creates quite impressive structures. So this whole idea of stigmergy or technology mediated social participation It's we see them also online. There's of course the paper of Francis about the stigmergy on Wikipedia, which is based on regulation by content. Here I want to show another kind of stigmergy where it's more related to the, social participation. So what you see over here is an issue queue where you have all kind of issues, right? And they have a status, they have a priority, they have a category, and all these elements like status, priority, category are actually signs that allows another agent to act on. Because basically, if the priority is critical, like here is a critical bug report, well, there are some people on the core development that probably say like, oh, this is very important, and then they will get into a closer look. There may be other people attracted by the title. There may be other people attracted by the stages. Like, let's see, this one needs review. So there are other people looking at the review process, and they will be attracted by this small sign here. So this is the queue itself. What you see over here is another way of mediation. Um, it just counts all the possible contributions a person has made. But what you see here is now that this D Rhine person actually is one of the main maintainers, and Merlin of Chaos is like the main maintainer of the issue called views, right? So you get a better idea also who to contact with. So it's not just the technology, it's also a kind of a social level and the participation between them all. And what you can actually start doing is, or you participate to the technology itself, or you participate on the social level. And so the last thing below here, it's another well, basically those common commits here are inserted in what is called Git, and this is the nice symbol of Git. Git is a version control system software developers use to upload their data. So you have all this technology, and you have all the people, and you have all the stigmergy, and that's what makes it work. Now, going to another case where you see that at least some people in governance are getting it. This was an experiment called Apps for Democracy. You can find it online if you search for this. And the basic idea is very simple. So you create open data, open source, right? Plus citizens' talents, which they indicate as the 2.0 perception, right? The 2.0 zeitgeist. And what you then add extra is fame and fortune. Like think about talent shows. Think about the food revolution is also an example of that. But you have many of those talent shows like So You Think You Can Dance, Next Top Model, a Prime Chef, or you get all kind of these talents where you see that fame and fortune is basically what they try to do then they create kind of an event out of it. And that creates some very interesting dynamics, because basically what you see is that people can surpass themselves. They become more humane than they would without that medium. That's an interesting phenomenon. You can see that people grow better and faster thanks to these new kinds of media. So in this case of the Apps for Democracy, what actually they did afterwards as a way to validate, like, was this a good setup? They validated the 47 web, iPhone, and Facebook apps they had, and they estimated the cost that it would have taken them if they would do it the conventional way, which would have been something like 2 million.3. So then they looked at like, okay, and so our actual cost of the whole event was like, I think it was something like $30,000 dollars price tag, and then 20,000 for the organization, something like it. And I don't know the details. You need to look them up. But basically, if you do the maths, you see that there's a 4,000% returns of investments here. And that kind of opened the eyes of many people in governance. And the person behind this experiment has been the CIO for the United States for the last years. I forgot his name. Okay, so let's get back to that embodied global brain, right? So we've seen a little bit about what is happening at this moment, how our media is changing us. Remember, the clue in the medium is the message. So what is happening here? What are we doing? How does this relate back to the other idea that a brain in a vat is a stupid idea? How does this relate back to embodiment? So basically what I found is a very interesting case talking about chartered cities. So this diagram here I took from them, and they looked at um, Hong Kong, and it's very interesting history because basically it was a compromise between the Chinese Empire and the British Empire, but a compromise nonetheless, and it created a very specific environment with their own rules and their own behavior. And then later on, that city got reintegrated into China, and how that happened, the whole process there is very fascinating. And what people from behind this concept of charter cities are claiming is that basically the whole case of Hong Kong did more to the development of China than any possible other development aid that existed before it. So the question is, can you actually? They start thinking about building like high creative cities as a way for development aid. Now think about that. That's an interesting case. I mean, in the cases they show, they are creating a city in Honduras, but they are like thinking about Cuba or North Korea to create this. This is very interesting because what you actually see is that many of those nations that closed themselves from the world did that for a good reason because they lacked a part of an evolution that many of the other nations were having for some reasons, but for some reasons they were not. And so the best way to react to that is then actually to go in a defense and close yourself off. If you're not compatible, that's not a strange thing to do. I mean, if you go back to the food revolution, you'll see that Jamie came into a city that kind of got itself closed up. But if you do it the right way, you can open it up again, and you can empower the people themselves to make the change. So how does this fit an idea of development aid? Basically, what you can do is give people choice. Everything always starts with a choice. So what you have is that in very close countries that some people don't feel at home in, they will try to flee and go to a place where they do feel at home. So, but if you give them an option, then you get a very interesting dynamics. And basically, if you look at the United States, you see that their cities are mostly very progressive environments, while rural places are more conservative. So it's a kind of a very natural selection happening because people get choice, people can move. That also means that people inside the city that feel that all that progress is annoying and there are too many people and so on, they can simply go back to the rural part. So you try to create a choice. So basically what they see is that if they want to keep their creative power, they will need cities where they allow that creative power to progress. And Hong Kong seemed to be that kind of city where instead of fleeing to other big cities, the Chinese could have gone to Hong Kong. Basically, that's what I understand from their presentation. So what they are doing in Honduras now is creating an economical free zone that allows these big investors to create a new city on, and gives the people in Honduras the ability for a choice. So, but I like to bring this back to technology-mediated social participation and meta-system transition, because this small graph they have in their in their talk is basically very useful for our global brain embodiment. A village is too small, a nation is too big, but a city is exactly what we need. Now, when I gave this presentation, I didn't really put a lot of attention to this slide, but basically I think this is the most important slide in the whole presentation, because what it shows us is that, well, it's not people who are the neurons in the global brain, it are cities. And that means that we can actually look at the slower emerging that's happening around city development, which has nothing to do with technology mediated social participation or anything to do with self-organization yet. But try to figure out everything we did so far, like the flash mopping, the Git repositories and so. This is mostly with groups of, let's say, a few. It's on the level of a village, right? That's where we are at the moment. Think if that would actually keep growing, become better, more productive, we can probably go from 3,000 to maybe a million, or even maybe few million people. So I expect there that technology mediated social participation to improve and be able to mediate a million, or let's make even 10 million people, right? So that's one transition. But now in the rest of the presentation, I will actually look at cities and see what's happening with city developments to understand if we can actually see a little bit more about that level. So first of all, let's look at cities, right? This is a picture of the Earth taken by night. And what you kind of see are all the cities highlights, right? And maybe you don't make this connection right away, but what I kind of make the connection here is this. I've seen this before. I've seen this kind of uh, small dots with small interconnections before. Basically, if you look at if you have something in your fridge that should have been eaten weeks ago, you may actually see a kind of a fungus kind of behavior here. And this is how I make the link with the evolution of life, where you go also to meta-system transitions. And one of the meta-system transitions is transitions from what is called surface metabolisms to the first cells. So before there were cells, there was something called surface metabolisms. And what I'm getting much the impression here is that our natural growth of cities is a little bit like the surface metabolism before the first cells. And so I'll get to this idea that basically the technological singularity, so 2045, may actually tells us a little bit more about how such a closure to such a meta-system transition may occur. So, but that's what I will come into. So basically, if we compare it with the evolution of life, we can actually see that one of the mistakes I think that exists with the global brain metaphor is the scale. It's not people that behave as neurons, but it's basically cities that behave as neurons, while people behave as ribosomes. So what is a ribosome? A ribosome is what transforms the RNA to forgot the word, to proteins, right? And proteins are the building blocks of all the materials around in life. So basically it uses information and it fabricates. Now, doesn't that appear very similar to how we as so humans actually use information and then actually create technology with it? So technology may actually metaphorically be comparable to our proteins, while our internet may be metaphorically more, well, our information, which in cells, of course, is stored in the nucleus, kind of helps us to fabricate that. So, okay, we are not yet there, right? I think at this moment we are not yet getting to a cell, but maybe this is a scale. Maybe we are ribosomes, and the neurons firing are specific cities we create, and that's where I'm going to get at, because basically, if you look at cities, they are not as specialized as a multicellular organism. I mean, here you see just a small snippet of some of the different cells we have, right? So can we actually go out there and see kind of a diversity happening in cities. Basically, some of the cities are old, right? Here you see it. It's a very natural grown city. Others are very new, okay? So that's what we do see. But then we see parts of the city that are specialized. Like here we see a district that's quite industrial. On the left here, I think it's... yeah, well, I think both will are industrial, right? This is probably a chemical industry, while this is more manufacturing or something. I'm not sure. Maybe someone knows where this is. Okay, but let's move on. Basically, what I want to show is that parts of it are fabrics, right? Just as we have in cells, we have our fabrics. So you do see parts of it. Other parts of it contains our information, right? Here, this is nice. I think this is probably Silicon Valley, right? This is the buildings of Oracle. You see clear here, Oracle, but they have this like they built like they kind of represent their data storage, right? Because that's the way they present their data storage. So they had their architecture actually visualize that. But this is kind of very interesting because this is actually our data storage. This is the data storage of our global brain. Well, not this. I mean, this is just an example, right? So maybe you can compare this with the nucleus, right? So it's part of the environment. Now it's always parts. It's not yet cities. But basically, what you see is that some of these really large constructors are kind of almost creating a city from scratch. That's another concept, by the way, you can find in literature called cities from scratch. Over here, I think this is one of the examples that show that a little bit, but let's try and look at it a little bit more in detail. Forgot. I think it's Hong Kong. No, no. This is somewhere in... Okay, I forgot which city this is. Okay, sorry. I think I knew it when I gave the presentation, but I kind of forgot it at the moment. So, but basically you see that in 10 years time, this is the same picture, right? You see that the water seems to become smaller a little bit, but it's basically because it's this photo is taken from a bigger height, right? So that's why you see also better the things behind there. But basically, this is created in 10 years time. Well, that kind of starts becoming the idea that you can clone cells, right? So it's not yet closed. It's still more of similar to surface metabolism. It's growing everywhere, right? There are no boundaries or anything, but it's at least in 10 years time this happens. This is even in this was 20 years. Sorry, 20 years time, right? I think we are almost getting to 10 years. I think at this moment cities can be created in 10 years. But this is, I think this is Dubai, if I'm not mistaken. But you see those buildings over here, so it's still the same. Those few, I think, are there too. I think if you look carefully, they are still there. But I'm not sure about those. But the three over here are still there, right? You see that the street clearly has exploded. It became twice as big. But you kind of mean like streets are like blood vessels, right? And so you see this change in almost 10 years, right? So we are not yet there to really create full new cities and design them, but there are some architects that start getting closer and closer to this goal, basically because they are, of course, innovating all the time as well. This is Gwan Gil. It's I tried to search for projects that are ratified. I couldn't find a picture of the construction pit at the moment, but I guess this should be one big construction pit at the moment. And basically, it's not a full city, but it's a part of a city, and it should harvest 770,000 people. There is another project, Waterfront, that aims at 1.5 million people. So there you kind of see that they are building a city almost the. So earlier on I said that I expect this technology-mediated social participation to go like to a million or so. So basically you now see that there are also architectural constructions capable of creating space for 1 million. So try to think about this, that if we get maybe in a few more years, we can actually really create a city from scratch, but maybe by technology-mediated social participation. Now, personally, I think that would be really crazy, that cities could be created in a very short amount of time, but by a public empowerment. So let me get to wrap up. So technology singularity, which we expect 2045, it's about, so my first question is, if we use cities as a metric, we can actually understand what will happen after 2045, because basically what we see is that at this very moment it's still surface metabolism, right? Cities are not constrained in the way cells are. But if you think about if you think about sustainable development, you see that we need to go to zero waste. But isn't that kind of creating a city? I'm not sure if there will be like really a boundary around it or something. I mean, you shouldn't try to push the metaphor uh, fully, but try to understand how some of those behaviors are the same. So can we use cities as metric? Now, if we do it, we may actually see that 2045 is the moment when we expect a kind of a closure to happen. And we expect technology-mediated social participation to meet city constructions and actually become one big entity. And so when I gave this presentation, I actually didn't consider it a feasible idea, but during the summer that followed it, I actually saw some in IT management conferences. I actually saw people showing how to use technology mediation in planning, in city planning. And I was very surprised that basically there are tools at the moment that integrate social participation for city planning. So maybe this isn't that crazy after all. So, but one thing is very certain: if any of this has some grounding, then going from cities to multicellular, so from cells to multicellular, is a big step. So maybe 2045 may be a moment where city construction by social participation is a fact. But then, I mean, the diversity between the cities, that's going to take a lot longer. So we can actually try to use cities as a metric and then understand that from, let's say, 2050 on, probably specializations in city construction will be more relevant, and how that behavior will change. So that's one part, right? So I mean, I'm glad to try this out. So maybe well, we'll see how that works. But basically, you can also use this in another way around. I mean, I started by looking at the origin of life, and now I'm wondering, like, this seemed to be so much in line. Can't we actually use what is happening at this very moment to tell anything about the evolution of cells? And it starts creating me a very controversial position that maybe cellular, so multicellular and single cellular, is actually a specialization, a little bit like if you look at the eusocial creatures like ants and termites. Well, if you take, for example, the naked mole rat, which is uh, a mammal version of the eusocial creatures, you see that they became blind, they lose many of their sensors. Maybe multicellular and cellular comes from a more primitive entity that where you actually see that eukaryotic and prokaryotic are specializations from. I mean, in more recent work, I read someone saying, like, if you want to understand navigation, you don't go looking at a Boeing because basically one of the latest flight crafts have so much more complexity in there. They have evolved so much more. And what I'm starting to understand is that in the principle of bootstrapping logic, like more is less, maybe the first cells are more like our cities today. And that's an interesting, I think, a very interesting way to think about it, because it may actually explain us also a little bit about the why we can't find any, why there is just one code in on the biochemical level. Maybe that's because basically I would love to start creating an experiment on showing how cell division actually may existed before there were cells. Because if you can show that mobilization as okay, but let's not try to go in that. I'll do that for another presentation, because it's a little bit too difficult, but to express it here. But basically, what I think is that you can actually understand from the evolution of a city. Maybe we can actually create some experiments on the evolution of life, to show how first there was kind of a mobilization and later on there was a kind of closure, and how that actually some of that evolved more into what we see in multicellular organisms, while others got dropped out and became prokaryotic cells. So maybe we can actually create some experiments on the evolution of life even. So okay, that's basically it.